Edition of Sales TV Live. Today, we're mastering the art of influence without manipulation. I'm joined by Bill Burnett. Bill is a business consultant and fellow adjunct professor, author of 5 books and counting. Bill brings a wealth of knowledge and experience in transforming sales approaches through behavioral economics, psychology, and neuroscience. Bill, welcome.
Oh,
Please
my
tell us a
pleasure.
little
And
bit about yourself and your journey as to how you got here today.
sure. Well, first of all, thank you. I really appreciate, Rob, you inviting me onto your show. So, my background is actually financial services, and I ran global operations for a company called Diners Club International, which is a credit card brand, and it's bigger outside of the U.S. than it is in the U.S. In that role, because it was a franchise organization, we had 52 independent CEOs. And under the agreement, we had to get 100% of those CEOs to agree to any change. And I was brought aboard to make changes, to move from a paper-based international business to an electronic and automated settlement business. And I needed to get all of them to agree. And very often in the changes that we were proposing, there were people who were advantaged by the change and people who were disadvantaged. And you can imagine that the advantaged people were not much trouble in convincing them to go along with the change, but for the people that were disadvantaged, a little more challenging. And so we developed a methodology to enable people to absorb the change and ultimately agree to the change, even when they were a bit disadvantaged. And we did that by applying some simple insights out of psychology. And that sort of set me on the path of utilizing psychology to influence business outcomes in a lot of different areas, sales being one of the prime areas for how you can impact the outcome of a sale based on understanding a little bit about psychology. So that's how I got to this point.
Excellent. So let's start with a question that I think will set the foundation for today's talk. How do you differentiate between influence and manipulation, especially in sales?
You know, it's always a tough issue. You know, you mentioned I teach up at the university in the business school, and I teach a number of courses in which influence comes up. And what I point out to the students is there's almost no human interaction in which there isn't some level of influence at play. You know, we're trying to make people laugh, or we're trying to make them like us more or love us, right? There's always something underlying, even if we're not that consciously aware that we're engaged in some influence, but we are. And so I raise that with the students. And then I say, look, the heart of any business is marketing, and the heart of marketing is the value proposition to customers. You get that right, the rest of the business is pretty easy. And what that value proposition really is all about is how you go about, how you go about influencing the behavior of the customer. You want to get them to buy and use and love, and then recommend your product to others. And that's influence. And then I say, you know, somebody will say, well, I feel uncomfortable with, you know, that influence role. And I said, well, that's fine. Just recognizing that you're always engaged in some level of influence. Clearly, you're comfortable with some level. And the rule of thumb here is the difference between influence and manipulation is you're trying to influence somebody to do something that you feel is in their best interest. That's influence. Manipulation is when you're trying to influence somebody else's behavior for your benefit, and you know, be damned their benefit or outcome. And so then I say, look, the rule of thumb here is pretty simple. If whatever you're doing doesn't feel comfortable, then don't do it, right? If you're worried about being, you know, verging on being manipulative, don't do it. Just stick with what feels comfortable.
So we like to think we live by the golden rule: do unto others as they would do unto you. But then we talk about things like psychology, influence, and even manipulation. And back to that do unto others. Well, we also like to think that we have free will over the decisions that we make. So if we are then influencing somebody, does that go against our very nature? And I think you sort of alluded to that in the differentiation there. But how do you address people who struggle with the thought of influence at all?
I think that you just have to let people get used to the idea that whatever they do, social circumstance is probably going to have some element of influence in it. And once you can get used to that, you recognize that every advertisement, every endorsement you ever make about a product is really about influence. And so even if it's, between friends, you bought a new car, you love it, you tell your friend about it, you're really trying to get them to like your car as much as you do, right? You want them to join the club with you. And we do a lot of that every day in our everyday lives. Excuse me, I'm battling a little bronchitis, and it's chosen this moment to raise its ugly head.
Naturally.
But at any rate, people just have to become comfortable with the notion that at some level they're being influential. And if you're going to be in sales or in marketing, it goes along with the job. And the truth is if you're going to be successful in almost any role in business, you have to be reasonably good at influencing your colleagues, at least, to go along with stuff that you think is the right thing to be doing.
I would agree with that. And one of my favorite authors, Dan Pink, has a book called To Sell is Human. In that book, he says 9 out of 10 people these days are sellers. And he defines sellers as those trying to influence. So I think what we, especially those of us in sales, are battling against is the negative connotation that sales and even the word influence have these days, and we equate them with manipulation. So in that context, what are some ethical considerations you think sales professionals should keep in mind to ensure that they maybe are influencing, but definitely are not manipulating?
Well, I think the really crucial benchmark is what you're trying to do going to be good for the other person? And if the answer is yes, then it's reasonably fair game to try to influence that behavior in them. If you're not sure whether it's going to be good for them or not, then it's time to back off, right? And so from a sales perspective, the truth is, in sales, if you sell something to somebody that they don't need or want because you're just such a good salesperson, that's a win, but it's actually a long-term not a win because it's always going to come back and bite you at some point in the future. So you're always better off keeping that. The golden rule of sales, if you will, is keep the other person's best interests in mind, is a good rule to follow. If you're not following that, then there's a fair chance you're engaged in some manipulation. Maybe it's just minor manipulation, but that's what it is.
And that's to your long-term detriment, is it? What I think I hear you saying.
That's right. That's right. It always comes back and gets you. And so, mostly in unseen ways, right?
Oh, yeah.
So, you get a customer who's unhappy with you. They aren't going to tell you that. They're just not going to buy from you anymore, but they're going to tell everybody else about the experience they had with you.
What are some common challenges salespeople face in practicing ethical influence, and how might you overcome those challenges?
Well, there's lots of people who write about sales. I'm not pretending to be a great expert in sales. I know a little bit about some things, right? But I think that the key skill for a really good salesperson is the ability to listen well. And listening well means that you hear what the other person is saying, you absorb it, and then you can utilize what they say to continue the conversation in a direction that's ultimately going to get them to buy the thing that you really think they should be buying.
This just popped into my head. What might another word for influence be that doesn't carry that baggage with it? And I don't know that you have an answer to it. That's more of a question that I'm sitting on now that we talk about the negative connotation that manipulation most definitely has, and for some, sales has.
Yeah. So in the context that I use it, I haven't had a problem using the word influence because I always set it up with this distinction between influence and manipulation, and it's a definitional distinction. So when I'm in the classroom with MBA students, for example, we set that as the benchmark. That is, influence is where you're trying to do something good for the other person, and manipulation is when you're not. And with that as a definition, then we can talk about influence, removing some of that charge that's around the word manipulation. But there'll be times during the course of the semester when they get conflated again by some student, and then we step back and we reset that. Here what we're talking about is something that you can't get away from. You can't get away from exerting some influence on customers, because that's fundamentally what marketing and sales are all about. And in some respects, everybody in the company plays a role in the value proposition one way or another. It might be the shipping clerk who's talking to the customer on the other end who's receiving the shipment, right? That's a customer interaction that has influence in it. The shipping clerk is trying to calm down the other party, or just inform them of what the situation is and when their goods will arrive, or if they've got to return, how to do it, right? So this is a customer interaction that has elements of influence in it that can't be avoided.
What I think I'm hearing you say is, whether you intend to influence or not, you have that influence just merely by interacting. But
Yeah.
Being aware of that is something completely different. And you can control that for your benefit or their benefit or the mutual benefit.
Right.
Okay. Let's talk a little bit about leadership now. How can leaders support salespeople in terms of influence, but not manipulation?
Well, I think that having a company that's got ethical standards, and ethical standards aren't defined by some statement of values. They're really defined by behavior. We've had lots of studies that show that companies that put out these beautiful value propositions, internally the behavior doesn't match the value statements. We also know that people are greatly influenced in their behavior by their social surroundings. And a great example is that I used to give a talk on job interviewing, and I would say that in the course of it, I says, everybody cheats. And I'd always get somebody who would say, wait a second, I don't cheat, right? And I said, okay, great. Well, how did you get here this morning? And they said, well, I drove. And I said, so you drove at or below the speed limit the entire time here? Well, of course, in the United States, nobody drives at or below the speed limit, right? We all speed. Well, that's a form of cheating. It doesn't feel like cheating. And the reason that it doesn't feel like cheating is because everybody else is doing it. And we take our cues from our social surroundings, what other people are doing. And so we feel very comfortable going, 5 to 7 to maybe 10 miles an hour over the speed limit. And certainly there's some people who obviously feel very comfortable going much faster than that over the speed limit, particularly here in Illinois, where I live. So that's really an example of how we are all the same. So from a leadership perspective, what you want to do is set the behavior, the model the behavior that you want. It doesn't matter what you say, it's what you do that really counts. When it comes to how you interact with people, I would coach that what you should focus on in your people is to develop within them a deep sense of ownership in the work that they do, the outcomes they create, the company that they work for. And we know from psychology that there's tools that we can utilize to help people develop that deep sense of ownership. Now, I apply that to customers as well. So when we get deeper into value propositions, I think I mentioned to you that I've got this workshop that helps companies really take a deep dive into their value propositions to get at those emotional triggers that we know are what really drive a decision. A lot of the stuff we do in marketing and sales is all information. We're dumping information on the customer, but that's not what drives the result. So with trying to develop that deep sense of ownership in your people, you want to enable them to get the identity that they want, that is to be seen by other people in the way they want to be seen by other people, which sometimes you have to discover what that is, because different people can do the same job and want to derive a different identity from that. Somebody wants to be a great problem solver. Somebody wants to be a great helper of other people. Those kinds of different identities. The second one is meaning. How can the work be meaningful to me personally? And so companies always will publish their mission, right? This is why we do what we do. But this fellow in Brazil, Ricardo Semler, who's been a very successful businessman, said, companies should have mission statements. That's all fine and good. But what really matters is, what is the personal mission of the person in your company? And are you enabling them to pursue that mission? So you've got to find a mission that lines up with the work they do, and that becomes meaningful to the person. And so you have identity, then you have meaning. And the last piece of developing a deep sense of ownership is to have kinship. That is, we're social animals. We invest ourselves a lot in our social activities, even people who claim, not to be, but they're spending half their day online, or they're gaming with other people. They're actually having all these social interactions. And those matter a lot to us. So at work, if you can have good kinship, good feelings with the people that you work with, that you're friends with. When I was coming up, I think it was much easier than it is today, because today we have a lot of stuff that is in those days was politically correct, but isn't anymore. And so we would go out together, we'd go dancing, we'd go drinking, we'd socialize together. We'd go on weekend trips together. We did whitewater rafting and all that sort of stuff, which I think is much harder to do now. Although I'm encouraged to see some of that post-COVID emerging. My son is visiting. He works in Seattle, and he now goes climbing with his colleagues at work a couple, 3 times a week. And he's really got into this. It's in a gym where you do all this climbing, but he's getting pretty good at it. He's very enthusiastic, and it's a social activity for him. And I'm very happy to see that kind of thing is going on, because it certainly was easier when I was coming up than I think it is today. Anyway, so you want to create this deep sense of ownership in your people, including your salespeople. You want them to own the outcomes that their customers enjoy as a result of using your products and services.
Did I hear you say something along the lines of values are more than just things that you post on the wall?
Yeah.
So what are they?
So in some respects, they're what we agree on is the proper behavior for us as human beings. And obviously there's different cultures with different kinds of nuanced behavior, but there's some things that are fairly general. You mentioned the golden rule. I mean, that's a pretty common sort of a foundational element to a civilization, to a social group. So what are those values? Well, surprisingly, they're pretty fluid. I mean, we know, for example, there was a study done on people who do the automobile inspections, right? Now, in Illinois, it's done by the government. So there's state-owned facilities that you go to, and they inspect your car, and all it is, it's a pure inspection. They don't offer to fix it or anything else. But in other states, there are licensed inspectors. These are garages or gas stations or mechanic shops that have a license to do the vehicle emissions inspection. And their motivations aren't quite as simple, right? Because they make their money not just on the inspections, but on fixing a car to get it through the inspection. And so there's an opportunity for cheating. And if there's an opportunity for cheating, you can bet somebody's going to cheat. And it turns out in those states, the license is held by the individual. So as they change jobs into different facilities, they take that license number with them. And there's just millions of inspections that are done every year. And so they can categorize these things by make, model, year, and so on to see what percentage pass. And then they compare that to different companies that are doing the inspections, and they can see different behaviors. So they can see companies that clearly are cheating on the inspection. They're passing cars they shouldn't be passing, or they're failing cars that they shouldn't be failing. And there's motivations for either one. You fail a car, you could fix it. Hey, listen, I'm sorry your car didn't pass, but I can do a little tweak. It'll only cost you $20. That'll get you through the inspection, right? Something like that. Or, your car actually didn't really qualify, but I fixed the numbers so you passed. You're good for this year. What does that guarantee? Well, guess where you're going next year to get your inspection, right? So there's a lot of motivations for cheating. And it turns out that these inspectors, when they changed jobs, it took only a matter of 3 or 4 days before their behavior adjusted to the standard of behavior in that new company. So if they left a company that never cheated and joined a company that did cheat, guess what? They join in. And vice versa. You were in a company that cheated a lot. This new company doesn't cheat. Guess what? You don't cheat either. So it's a remarkably impactful study because it says a lot about human behavior. And we know that as humans, we follow other humans pretty readily. And the Milgram experiments, which you probably studied at some point in school, right? It'd be your Psychology 101 class, where they had people shock other people as part of a learning experience. And they started at 45 volts and went up to 450 volts or something. Now, there was no actual real shocking going on because the other party was the actor, but the people participating didn't know that. They thought they were really shocking the other person, giving them that electric jolt. And it went up by 15 volts each time. And they had behind them somebody standing with a lab coat on and a clipboard, the authority figure, who would encourage them to keep going. They would say, oh, the other person is screaming. They're begging me to stop. No, your job is to keep going. This is part of the experiment. And with no other coercion than that, people went ahead and shocked all the way up. The first person to stop was at 300 volts. Well, if it was really 300 volts, the other person's dead, right?
Yeah.
But over half the people, I can't remember the numbers exactly, but it was close to half, went all the way up to the 450 volts. And for the last 15 shocks, there was no sound coming from the person on the other side of the barrier, the learner. So you can assume that they're not conscious anymore. But people went ahead and followed those orders. We, as human beings, are greatly flawed in our decision making, and of course, every salesperson knows that, and that's sometimes where you get from influence into manipulation.
So, do you have any guidance for defining the values? What should an organization consider when they're doing that?
Well, the basic things are be open in your communication, and that's difficult. I mean, you've got to set an environment where people are willing to be open, where there's the consequence of being open isn't blame and reclamation, and we're not going to punish you. It's okay. What do we do now? What have we learned from this, and how does that influence us going forward? And of course, there's a lot of companies where that's not the way people operate. Right. And so what happens is people become less candid. They hide things. When the fellow from Boeing took over General Motors, no, he took over Ford, sorry. And at first, they had these meetings of all the division heads, and they had these charts that said green, orange, and red, indicating the status of different projects. And nothing came in as a red condition. And as the CEO, he knew that probably wasn't true. So he finally set up for this went on for weeks, and he finally set up with one of his division heads to come in and report something red. And all of a sudden, it wasn't the CEO jumping down your throat because your project is off schedule. It's, oh, great. Let's get together here and figure out how we turn this into green. And so it was always, let's go forward. which then the next week there were a lot of reds reported from different divisions because now it was safe to do so.
Right.
So the leader really sets sort of the agenda of how people respond to things. And either you set the agenda that you think about the behavior you want your employees to exhibit with your customers and with each other. Well, they're going to mirror whatever it is that you're doing. And so, be very thoughtful about that. And for leaders, I would coach them, try to make as few statements as possible. Turn every statement you can into an open-ended question, and try and make that question start with the word how, or second choice is what. Don't ask why questions because they tend to be accusatory. So if a great leader will ask a lot of how questions, okay, how do we fix that? Right. So
I like that. We are approaching the end of our time, but before we wrap up, any final thoughts? What advice might you give to aspiring sales professionals about developing their approach?
Well, I would say get really good at listening, get good at turning what you hear into an open-ended question that's going to further and deepen the conversation in the direction that you want it to take. I would say practice. Practice is always really helpful. The toughest sales situation, I think, is the job interview, right? Because then you're way too close to the product because it's you, and it's really important to you to make this sale, get them to make you that offer. And in that environment, my coaching to people is practice, 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 because you'll get better at answering questions and asking questions with that practice. So I would give the same advice to any salesperson in any sales situation: is a lot of practice, and then get really good at telling stories. So, and there's different models for setting up stories. I teach in this value proposition workshop, I teach two methods. One is the Chip and Dan Heath success model. They wrote a book called Made to Stick, which if you're in sales or marketing, you definitely should read that book. And then the other is the Pixar story beats methodology, which is actually available to anybody on Khan Academy. They did a partnership with Pixar and put this training up there. And it really shows you how to set up a story. And the heart of any story is creating anticipation in the listener. They want to anticipate what the outcome's going to be. It's that unexpectedness, if you can build it in, but just plain simple anticipation works really well. And it's why we like jokes. It's why we like magic tricks. It's why we like mysteries. It's because we know something surprising is coming at the end. And that's how, if you're a really good salesperson, you set up your stories with that anticipation at the beginning. And people who do that get people to repeat their stories, which as a salesperson is always great.
Absolutely. Well, Bill, this has been fantastic. Thank you very much. How can people learn more about what you're doing? How can they get in touch with you?
So I'm a pretty open connector on LinkedIn. So I would encourage anybody to connect with me on LinkedIn. I have some books that I've written. And if you look at my LinkedIn page, you can see the books that I've written. And they're reasonably informative. And then this workshop that I put together on value propositions is a really great way for a CEO to, one, get a much deeper value proposition and if you get that right, everything else in your business is much easier. But it's also an opportunity to build much stronger relationships with the people that work for you. It's just the way the program is designed. It causes that kind of interaction between the CEO and the individuals in the company. And so it's a win-win for not just the CEO, but for the company and for everybody else who participates in it. And it's open to everybody in the company. But, that would be a great way to interact with me.
Excellent. Well, to our audience, thank you very much for your active participation. Bill, thank you so much for being with us today. This has been another episode of Sales TV Live. Until next time,